Welcome back, everybody, to part two of my response, my reaction to Alternate History Hub's What If Germany Won World War I. I actually confess I didn't realize at the time that I was recording the reaction yesterday that there was a part two. I thought when we got to the end it seemed a little abrupt, like they didn't cover more of the story, and then I realized after I uploaded there was a part two. So if you didn't see part one, I'll put a link in the description to take you to my reaction, part one, as well as a link to the original content creator of this video, episode 2. And as always, please, if you like what you see and you want to see more, whether it's my reaction videos, my original content, visits to historic sites, things of that nature, please make sure you turn on the notifications so you never miss another video. Let's dive in to part 2.
In this alternate timeline, the German Empire, along with the Central Powers, won the Great War in a stunning victory against the Allies. It was not an easy victory, and it was not a quick one, but it was one which redefined the history of the modern world. Conflict has a way of reorganizing the stage along your own terms. This was seen in our timeline when the Allies forever neutered the Germans and Austrians from European politics.
I don't know if I'd say they forever neutered the Germans and Austrians from European politics, because it was only 15 years later that Hitler rises to power in Germany and very much becomes the central focus of politics in Germany. I understand what he's trying to say. I just don't know if it necessarily means forever in our timeline, because they certainly were very influential in the 1930s and 40s.
The reparations shrunk Germany's economy and territory, making it already fragile once the Depression hit, and the war saw the death of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By now, you probably know the ramifications of this. It was this initial defeat that immediately stopped the Germans' rise to power that had been occurring for the last half-century. A united Germany under Prussian rule was a formidable force. It wasn't a colonial power like Britain, France, or Russia, but it was still one with growing potential. When the Great War ended...
Now, that's another thing I would say. I mean, they weren't I agree with what he's saying. They weren't a colonial power like those other countries, but they were a colonial power. They had colonies in Africa. They had colonies in the Pacific. Certainly not to the degree that someone like Britain did, but they got in on the action. You know, the late 19th century, early 20th century is a time when these nations that want to be influential and powerful on the world stage are trying to gobble up colonies. And the United States even got in on this with Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, Guam, places like that.
And the Kaiser fled. This rise was finished. Germany went down the path of Nazism, which would only destroy it further, and led it into being split between two states for 5 decades until the 1990s. This was 80 years of being mostly subjected to foreign powers. Today, just 2 decades later, Germany is once again the economic power of Europe, through a democracy. But it's not difficult to see that a unified Germany probably would have gone down a different path in those lost years. This is part 2. When we left off, the Central Powers are victorious against the Allies. The Russians have been driven to civil war, and due to the territory acquired in the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, which doesn't completely collapse, Germany now is left with a sizable portion of Eastern Europe. You may have flashbacks to World War II, but keep in mind it's not like the Third Reich style conquering the East for Lebensraum. As per the treaty agreement, the Russians allow for the birth of new nations in the Baltics and an independent Ukraine, as well as the creation of the Cossack and Crimean states as well. The Germans begin the redrawing of the map. While these Baltic and Ukrainian states are technically independent, they are loyal to the German economy and the financial system.
So, yeah, this is real similar, and again, to what happens in our timeline. First of all, I want to say, refer to the Third Reich, and we've talked about this in other videos. The Third Reich, as Hitler called it, was because he considered that Germany had 2 previous empires, the Holy Roman Empire, and then the empire from 1871 to 1918 under the Hohenzollerns. And so this is very similar to what happened in our timeline, so it makes total sense, where after World War II, you have these eastern states that are technically independent, but all miraculously choose communist governments. So you're talking about places like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, who were satellite states of the Soviet Union, very much dependent on them, very much modeled after them.
almost like another entity we all know and love. But these states, all in all, are German puppets, with the German minority in each state being the highest class, including the rulers. This is Prussians, after all. Poland never really is discussed, so their future is muddled, and probably violent. Speaking of which, the Russian Civil War is still, of course, happening, and plans get muddled in war. It's easily foreseeable the conflict in Russia.
So imagine for a second in this timeline that you have, let's say for a second that the Soviet Union, they're victorious. And I should say, too, that we use the word communism, and that's what I grew up saying. We all referred to the Soviets as communists, to the Cubans as communists, to China as communist, Vietnam. But technically, if you look at their definition of communism, they're not communists because according to their idea of communism, communism is a stateless existence. And so if you have a government, you are, by their definition, not communist. It's an extreme form of socialism, but that's a discussion for another video. So imagine if the Soviet Union does emerge victorious in their civil war. I think that puts a lot of likelihood on France, a defeated France that has lost World War I, having a socialist revolution and ending up with a similar form of government. And now you've got Germany once again with two like-minded countries that are probably allied to each other on either side. But, and I think where he's going with this, I don't know that the Soviet Union does emerge victorious in a timeline where there's no World War going on anymore.
Blends into the plans with the Germans as the conflict spills over. Communists versus non-communists fighting in many areas of Eastern Europe. The stability of Russia is of the utmost importance to the Germans, as a Soviet state on their border is a catastrophe to the traditionalist Prussian culture. The White Army receives vast amounts of funding, support, and men to the front lines from almost every Western state, from Britain, France, Germany, and America. With this aid from the powerful German Empire, the Whites succeed, and the Soviets are crushed.
Makes sense.
The Soviet Union never arises. Which, if you want the full scenario on that, check out this video. Germany, while the dominant army on the continent, was just that, on the continent. It was always limited by the superior British Navy and, compared to others, always had a lackluster number of overseas colonies.
So there was a naval arms race that happens between Germany and the UK in the early 20th century. Now, certainly Germany never quite kept up, especially in terms of the power of their capital ships compared to the British. But Germany did have a pretty decent navy in comparison to the world, just not when you compare them to the British. They had a decent enough navy to be able to sustain colonies, I would think, in a situation where they've won the war.
Going into the war, Germany always had the ambition of stripping much of these colonies from their enemies. Had they won, nothing would have stopped this exchange. In this alternate timeline, what we see is something called Mittel Africa, or Middle Africa. The German Empire seizes British, French, and Belgian territory all throughout Africa.
So this is a very common expectation and viewpoint of people who talk about a what-if scenario where Germany wins the Great War. If you play a lot of the games like I do, a lot of the mods for the game Hearts of Iron 4 that use alternate history, there's ones like Kaiserreich in the name of the Tsar, Führerreich is another one, there's one called the New Order. Some of these explore a Central Powers victory in World War I and how the world looks different, and almost all of them end up with substantial German colonies in Middle Africa.
Effectively taking over most of the continent. It was basically connecting the three existing German colonies, allowing for one large swath of land across the African equatorial jungle and savanna. A direct empire across much of Africa and an economic dominant force in Eastern Europe is always a possibility. Rebellions would be put down hard. The likelihood of Germany succeeding at such a huge endeavor across so much land is hard to say.
I would say that I would feel pretty confident in Germany's ability to sustain those colonies because they did have a pretty significant land force. And without having to worry about their navy being challenged, at least for a time, I don't see any issues with them being able to sustain those land forces to be able to hold on to those colonies.
As the Germans lost against South Africa in our timeline, the Great War is over, and to the victor goes the peace. But the peace is only won if the victor is competent, which leads us to discuss the black sheep of the bunch, the Kaiser, Wilhelm II. During the war, he was mostly a figurehead, but when he made decisions, they were usually based on emotion and harmed Germany in the process. For Germany to have a successful peace, it would need to figure out the exact role the monarchy would play in this new Germany. The war showed that the Kaiser didn't need full authority, as his generals ran the country effectively by themselves, so the traditional role of the Kaiser wasn't entirely needed, even if Germany won. It's possible, due to Wilhelm's general incompetence, the German government would slowly begin shifting his power away from the monarchy and into the hands of the military or government.
So I would disagree with that, but let's back up for a minute, because yes, Wilhelm was largely hands-off by the end of the war. Ludendorff, Hindenburg, people like that were kind of running the show, both with the military but also with the civilian life. But that said, and Kaiser Wilhelm historically lived into like 1940. So he saw the rise of Hitler. He saw the beginning of World War II. He had fled to Belgium, I think, and was living in exile there. And I think he was still there when the Germans invaded Belgium. So he lived long enough to see all of that. But I will say this, though it's true that the military had the power, and that was, that's kind of how things went. We've talked about this before, too. If you are a dictator and you lose the people, you can generally stay in power if you still have the military. If you lose the military as well, it's very hard to stay into power. That's what happened to Tsar Nicholas. Once he lost the military, he was done. Once Wilhelm lost the military, he was done. Same thing. But in the instance where Germany wins the Great War, even though he may not have been really in power and the military was showing it, everyone's going to perceive that as his victory. And I believe that rather than that shifting power away from him after the war, I think that would strengthen his position as Kaiser. Even if he wasn't the one most responsible for the victory. I think a victory makes his position that much more strong.
This isn't to say a democracy, but it's a step away from an absolutionist monarch. In the West, there isn't so much a cultural change, but a shift in its potential. In our timeline, we went down one path, led by Britain, America, and France. In this timeline, that culture is Germanized. As I said in the last part, without the defeat of Germany being a nail in the coffin to prominent monarchies on our timeline, the legacy of monarchs and empires is less black and white. Monarchies prove they can still be semi-relevant in the 20th century. The main change here is Germany's legacy in the world. Before the war, Berlin was one of the main centers of finance, education, and art in the entire Western world. After the war, the legacy of Germany was a nation surrounded, and after Hitler, a nation which was too dangerous to be allowed to continue.
So I will say this, and I agree with him about one thing. I think one of the most significant impacts on the world in a timeline where the Central Powers win is on the form of government. Because you had empires in Germany, Russia, and Austria-Hungary that all collapse in the aftermath of the Great War. If those three stay together, you've got three emperors. And even in a civil war, even if Tsar Nicholas had stepped down, I think if the whites win, you've got a decent chance that you end up seeing a restoration of the monarchy in Russia. So you've got three significant world powers with emperors still in that timeline. So that's interesting to think about.
But in this alternate timeline, that legacy never exists. With new victories in the East and harsh treaties against the British and French, the Germans set themselves up to be economic masters of this new order. Just as the United States used World War II and the economic boom to spread its own culture across the world, so too does Germany. When you have a victor, though, there are certainly losers. The defeat at the hand of the Central Powers affects every allied nation differently following the signing of the Treaty of Paris and Treaty of London. Britain, while bitter, would be quick to adapt commercial ties with the Germans. Tensions still exist, however, due to Germany's new influence in Belgium.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I don't think that relations between Germany and Britain for example, would be that severe compared to what you would be seeing with France and Germany. That would be a pretty bitter thing for a long time to come. Same with America. I think America would probably have pretty good relationship with Germany in a post-war world.
The British Empire is diminished in Africa as the Germans take all of Middle Africa. Among imperialists, this is incredibly horrendous. The French as well aren't so forgiving. They would have lost 2 wars by then with the Germans, and a national call for revenge is prominent. It's likely the Treaty of Paris is harsh, just as Brest-Litovsk was against the Russians, and new reparations are forced upon the French this time too. Now, if this seems like just a switch of what happened against Germany in our timeline, it's not. After the loss against the Prussians in the Franco-Prussian War in our own timeline, the French were enraged, and mass anarchy and instability reigned. The Paris Commune was one such event where radical socialist troops took over the city for months. France was subject to disaster if it lost another war.
Yeah, and the Paris Commune in 1871 was violently put down by the French army because the French army had already been mobilized for the Franco-Prussian War. So they were able to do that. But they were also in the middle of that dealing with a major smallpox pandemic that broke out in Europe and killed 500,000 people. So it was a really ugly time in France in the aftermath of that war. So you can imagine how much more so if they also lost the Great War.
Which in this scenario, it does. It's likely nationalism and socialism rise in the country as it faces what to do against its enemy to the east. No matter what, this bad blood between the two nations doesn't go away, and most likely results in another war. Britain and France would become incredibly bitter after this loss. Speaking of allies, I never discussed Germany's, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottomans. Both countries themselves were the sick men of Europe, and it's unlikely they'd survive much longer throughout the 20th century. Yet, we don't care about that.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. I think even in victory, certainly the Ottoman Empire probably ceases to exist. They had just lost wars to the Balkan states. They were they were as weak as they had ever been. It's very likely that happens, and I think the same thing is true with Austria-Hungary. Austria-Hungary would have been more powerful than Austria ended up being, for example. But yeah, I can see that empire ending up breaking up at some point.
What was most important was how they died. Demographics are a main issue in the area of Ottoman control. The Great War and the decade following saw an incredible population shift in Anatolia. Following the war and the collapse of the empire, the chaos which followed saw a population exchange between the Greeks and Turks. In this alternate timeline, the Armenian genocide still occurs. There is deportation, murder, and genocide on a large amount of the population. The Ottoman Empire, a victor in the war, doesn't collapse, at least not yet, and so the Christian minority stays within the region well into the 20th century. Yet, there is still ethnic tension within the empire as its grip weakens. If the empire does collapse, history of ethnic civil war probably stays as it was in our timeline. That's just how it is. As for the Arabs to the south, the Middle East isn't simply divided into artificial states like Iraq or Syria after the war. When the Ottomans do collapse, the Arabs unite under larger, more natural states. Iraq is non-existent, and instead is divided between Shia and Sunni Arabs.
And that probably would happen. I can see that happening. Remember, the division of the Middle East, like he said, these are largely brand new countries that are created out of some of these areas.
The Kurds have their own nation as well. Wars between the groups still happen, but destabilization between groups into civil war, like in our timeline, rarely are such an occurrence. Israel simply doesn't exist in this timeline, but there is a much larger Jewish population within Europe, especially, unsurprisingly, in Poland. There is never a British Palestine, and never even Hitler, so the Holocaust never forces Jews to flee to a new land. Could fascism still rise? Possibly, but obviously not in the manner of our timeline. It would be harder, having to rise in countries with histories of democracy. As a whole, we see a Western civilization far more socially conservative than our own. Without World War II, which created such a societal shift, generations don't become disinterested in the old order.
Now, That's not to say there wouldn't be a World War II in this timeline. It would just look very, very different. And so we could still have those big societal changes. They just look very different.
Imperial might, empire, and colonies remain a desire because that was Germany's main prize for victory. Britain and France want their colonies back. America wants to be like Germany. Speaking of which, what is America doing? They never got involved in the war, and so the American public is largely neutral to a German victory. Of course, being culturally and economically closer to Britain meant that while the Allied loss was an issue, it wasn't catastrophic.
And culturally close to Britain, yes, but we have a significant German population here in the United States to this day. Not to the level of Britain, but Germany's right up there with, early settlers, especially in places like Pennsylvania, some of the upper Midwest, very heavily German.
What's done is done, and to the Americans, relationships had to be made with the victors and to mend ties. Being uninvolved in the war, the United States tries to reach across the aisle. It's not a global military leader, but economically it's strong. If the German economic plans worked, then they'd be a valuable partner. The millions of German immigrants across the Midwest don't have to abandon their heritage so quickly. In our timeline, the reason Germans assimilated so quickly was because of anti-German sentiment once America became involved in the war.
And, that's true. It happened in Britain. It happened in America. For example, in the town I live in, we had a street called Dutch Lane. Now, Dutch doesn't sound German, but if you've ever heard the term Pennsylvania Dutch is German. It came from the word Deutsch, which means German, and it just kind of got messed up a little bit. And Pennsylvania Dutch is like this hybrid between German and English that is spoken by a lot of Amish people. Especially like southeastern Pennsylvania, places like that. So Dutch Lane became a symbol of Germany in my town, and so they changed it to Liberty Street. The British royal family, who were German, they have been German for centuries. King George I was born in Germany, was the king of Hanover, and spoke German as his first language. George II spoke German as his first language. His grandson, George III, was the first member of the Hanoverian dynasty that spoke English as his first language. And then you have Queen Victoria marrying her German cousin, Prince Albert, and their house name was Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. It was German. So they changed it to Windsor to make it sound more English during World War I because they didn't want to be perceived as being German. That was a big, big deal that was going on in the Allied countries.
They were discriminated and hated, abandoning their culture to fit in. Without a war, many can continue to speak their native language, even entire isolated towns in the Midwest. As a result, the United States has a far greater Germanic influence mixed in with its English population. Throughout the 20th century, this influences financial and diplomatic relationships with the new power across the Atlantic. Because so much would be shifted by this victory, I can't account for exact specifics going into the rest of the 20th century. Any event could randomly change the course of history, even if Germany did win. The Great Depression certainly causes upheaval for countries across the world. But as a whole, simply following the events of our own timeline, whoever won the Great War forever shaped the 20th century in their image. Had Germany won, it has an immediate head start on this new age. Its Prussian influence, its economic might, and huge population means that the 20th century easily could have been the German century. This new era could look very similar to the old one. As European empires still fight for land, mentalities remain the same, at least for a little while longer. Even if the Kaiser eventually fell out of favor, Germany still benefits from this war, even if its allies did not. And perhaps German as a culture is far more influential across the world, spreading 3 entire continents. Of course, this is simply one scenario, an exercise of alternate history. But it's fun to theorize. This is Cody of Alternate History Hub.
So that was really cool. I liked that a lot. I think it was very well thought out. I think he covered the bases really well. And obviously, as some of us have talked about, you change one little ingredient in all of that, and the whole thing can shift. And that's what's fun about speculating on the what ifs of history, right? Because one little change can completely mess everything up and take you down an entirely different path. It's fun to think about. So I've given you some of my thoughts about what I think would happen, what I agreed with, what I think maybe I didn't agree with. But let me know yours. Use the comment section below. Make sure you check out all the links in the description. There's a lot of stuff there. And we'll be back tomorrow with another reaction video, some more original content coming this week, and some more streams as well. So be watching for those. Thanks for watching.